Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah J, and I have a new binding technique for you today that involves taking the backing fabric around to the front and using that to create your binding. So let's get started. So I'm here at my pressing board. I've spread out one edge of the quilt, and I am going to work on two opposing sides first. So I could do the two sides or the top and bottom, but I want to work on two opposing sides first. And we're going to turn the edges on those two sides. Then we will work on the two remaining sides. And please understand, as we get started, this is not a mitered corner binding. We are using the backing of the quilt to turn over and finish the edge of our quilt, but it's not going to have a mitered look on those corners. So that's something that really, I think, just needs to use regular binding method. I've got lots of videos on using regular binding or bias binding, so definitely check those out. All right, so I have marked this, and I am marking a line that is 2¼ inches away from the quilt edge, and a nice straight line here coming off of that corner. And I am going to be using scissors to cut this. You might be wondering why. I just found that marking this on my cutting board and then cutting with scissors, I found it worked really, really well. But you know, of course you could take this to your cutting mat and you could cut with your rotary cutter. Now also notice I have trimmed off my batting flush with the edge of the quilt. Had to do that with scissors too. And I also do have my victory lap stitched. Basically, I go around the outer edge of the quilt, and when I'm on my long arm especially, I do that as I'm stitching. I'll work through an area and then stitch along the edge just as I am quilting. So you might want to get in the habit of that if you're quilting on a home sewing machine too. And so that outer edge of the quilt is already stitched, is already secured. You don't have to worry about doing that with this method, because we are actually going to take this edge, we're going to flip it to the back, then flip it to the front. We're going to completely cover that stitching. It's not going to show up. Every time I played with this method, I always ended up with, that really ugly stitching showing, and it drove me crazy. So whenever I sat down to really play with this, I decided I wanted to be able to take that backing fabric and completely encase the edge, just like we do with traditional binding. So there we go. I have marked that, cut along it, not all that straight, that's okay. We're going to take that edge and we're going to fold it up so that the raw edge meets the edge of the quilt. And then grab your iron. I like a nice hot dry iron, and you're just going to press. Just press that in place so that way you're creating a solid crease line in that fold. And so that fold we cut 2¼ away from the edge of the quilt. When you fold that in half, that means that really you should have about 1 1/8 inches extending beyond the edge of the quilt. So there we go. We're going to prep up two sides this way, cutting that, folding it over. If you want extra brownie points, and for this to go just a little bit easier, you may want to apply some glue, in which case I've got Elmer's glue here in a micro tip bottle. And I can just run this, just a few little dots here, right along that edge. It's not going to show up, nothing to worry about. It's going to get concealed. And that can also help this technique go a little bit faster and a little bit easier, because essentially what that does is it glues those two pieces of fabric together. That folded over edge gets nicely glued to the inner edge, and then now it's going to all act as one, and that's going to help prevent little ripples and pleats and that kind of thing. So that's just extra. If you want to do it, I do think that it makes it just a little bit easier, a little bit faster. So this first line of stitching is actually done from the back of your quilt. You take that extended edge that we have folded over, you fold it to the back, and then you run a line of stitching 1/4 inch from the edge of the quilt. Now this stitching is going to be completely concealed, so you could use different colored thread. You can use up waist bobbin thread, whatever you want to do. Very, very easy stitching. So I'm going to flip the quilt over to the side that I haven't stitched yet. Now most of the quilt is going to be out of the arm of your machine, kind of flopping off the edge of your table, and this is one of those times that I really find having a quilt suspension system really handy. And just take that roller, I'm here on the opposite edge of my quilt that I've already stitched, roll that around, and then clip it on. And that's just going to hold that. It's going to be like an extra arm just holding that quilt onto the table for me so that way I don't have to worry about it sliding off and then pulling against me. So here's another perspective on that, just so that way you see what we've done. Here is that extra fabric, the backing fabric extended. We folded it over. The folded edge is right here. The raw edge is now in line with the raw edge of the quilt. And I had some extra batting extending beyond the edge of the quilt that I stitched. I don't have to worry about that. I don't need to pick out those stitches or anything like that. That area is going to be a little extra puffy because of the extra batting there. That's going to be just fine. Generally though, with this technique, you want to try not to have excess batting along the edge because it can throw it off a little bit. So all you do after having that secured, and this is why the glue, you see how that just holds those two pieces together? That just really, it just makes it feel a little easier to control the fabric. I just flipped that to the back, and we're going to get started stitching right at that top edge, making sure that that's folded all the way over. Slide it underneath the foot, and I'm just using my 1/4 inch foot included with the little rebel, the one that has the guide bar on it, but you know, I wiggled my guide bar off. I didn't like it, so I took that off, and that allows me to see that edge of the foot really clearly. I am stitching with blue thread just so you can see what I'm doing. Very, very simple. Okay, so now just make sure that all of that is in line. A few stitches on, reverse a few stitches. And then you can really put your foot down because this is so easy. Giving the backing fabric a nice press with a hot, dry iron really helps to stabilize everything. If you want to, of course, you could apply starch. But you know, if any fabric would be going loosey-goosey on me, it would be this one, because this is actually a used bed sheet that I used on the back of this quilt, and it's very stable. I'm not having any trouble controlling it or keeping it in line. Now you might be wondering why I use scissors to cut my backing fabric, and the reason is I find, because I have for years and years and years done, you know, either bias binding or I have cut binding, it is just routine for me to cut and trim the edges of a quilt. And if I have a rotary cutter in my hand especially, that's what I tend to do. And then once you cut off the backing fabric, you have to do the other kind of binding. You can't do this method. So I have found that I have to change things up and just have it feel totally different in order to remind myself what I'm doing. Those automatic habits can set in place, and so that's why I cut with scissors. But please keep in mind that you can absolutely cut this with a rotary cutter too. All right, a few stitches back, a few stitches forward. We are ready to go for the next step. So the next step, we're going to take that folded edge of the binding, we're going to bring it to the front, and we're going to stitch it down. Now I did switch to a matching colored thread here, and I know that that matches my fabric, so it's hard for you to see, but I really want this quilt to be nice and pretty for Betty. So sorry guys, I'm not going to use a contrasting thread here because I really want this to look nice. Now the stitching where it lands on the back is not going to be perfect because we're stitching this from the front, so the front looks good. On the back, you may find that that stitching is a little bit into the quilt, is a little bit onto the binding. You know, it might look a little bit ugly, but the thread, if you match it to the backing fabric, it's going to match the back, it's going to match the front, it's going to match everywhere, so you're not going to be able to see it. Now, what if you did not want the stitching to show at all, and you didn't want anything possibly looking bad on the back and nothing bad on the front? Well, to do that, you're going to have to hand bind it, in which case you fold that edge. We've got, you know, this is the folded edge of our backing binding. You just fold that to the front to match up with that stitching line we just stitched. You can see mine in blue, and you just fold that over to meet it and then hand stitch that down. And that's really the only way to get a 100% perfect finish. Me personally, I think that this looks a-okay when stitched by machine. It's so much faster, so much easier. And really, honestly, this looks like traditional binding. Because of the way we folded that over and stitched it, I don't even think that a quilt show judge would necessarily know. I mean, the corners will give it away. But I think that this is a very secure binding technique. It does have 2 layers of fabric going all the way around the edge of the quilt. I don't see any problem with it personally. And for a quilt that's not going to be entering into a show that Betty is just going to drag around her bedroom and cuddle up with on the couch, this is going to be perfectly fine. So I'll pull up my thread here. And what I'm doing, I'm going to bring that folded edge of the binding and I am taking it past that line of stitching in blue. I'm taking it past that just a little bit, and then now I'm going to stitch right along that edge. Now, one thing I gotta say, I really wish that the Little Rebel had an edge stitching foot. That would be so good. But as it is right now, I just continue using the same foot that I've been using, and I just kind of eyeball that. Not that hard to do, but you know, it's one of those wish listy things. I do wish that we would get an edge stitching foot soon. Now we're ready to work on the opposite edges of our quilt. Remember that we did the top and bottom first, and then now we're doing the two sides, or vice versa, whatever works best for you. But you want to do two opposing sides first, and now we're going to finish up with the two remaining sides. And we do that so that way we can handle these corners really nicely. So what I've done is I've decided to actually shrink the amount that I'm going to cut my backing fabric to 2 inches, so that I've measured out from the edge of the quilt into the backing fabric 2 inches. I'm just going to try that out, and I really want you to just see that this is variable depending upon how you attach your binding and your seam allowance and stitching and all of that kind of good stuff. You might want more fabric, you might want a little bit less. And I want you to know that there isn't a single right or single wrong way to do this. Now what's really important is over here on this edge, we have this fabric extending, and I made sure to extend that fabric on purpose because we need an extra anywhere from 1/4 to 1/2 inch of fabric extending beyond the finished edge of the binding on the side. So make sure that you have at least 1/2 inch extra over here. And then again, I'm going to grab my scissors and cut this. And again, I use scissors because when I grab my rotary cutter, I tend to just cut through everything because that's the way I'm used to binding. And whenever we try something new and use a new technique, sometimes you really have to just get out of that habit. And grabbing some scissors really helps me out a lot with this. All right, so I'm going to cut that all the way down. But let's talk about folding this corner because this is really important at this stage. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take that extra flap of fabric that I've cut, I'm going to fold it over nice and straight to the edge of the quilt. So we have a nice folded edge. And don't worry if the corner is looking a little Raggedy Ann right here, Raggedy Andy. You're getting some frayed fabrics and stuff. That's okay. It's going to be completely bound up and it's not going to show. So nothing to worry about there. So we folded that over. If you want to, of course, you can do a few little dots of glue just to help yourself out. Keep that fabric folded over, especially if your backing fabric is, you know, when I'm using bed sheet material, no big deal. There we go. That's folded over. And then now I'll do the exact same thing, folding that raw edge of the backing fabric up to meet the edge of the quilt, just like before. Only now you can see we've got nice folded edge on that corner, and that is going to be what finishes the edge, that corner of our quilt. Very, very nicely. So you're going to repeat this step for each of the corners, have an extra 1/2 inch of fabric extending beyond the edge of your binding on the sides that you've already done. Fold that in first and then fold your backing fabric over, bringing the raw edge of the backing to meet the edge of the quilt. And again, you can just tack that down with some glue dots and give it a press, and we will be ready to do that stitching again. So now we're going to stitch our backing binding to the back of the quilt exactly as we did before, making sure to leave nice long thread tails. So this is what it's going to look like whenever you get it finished. Very, very easy stitching. One of the most important tips here is to make sure that the folded edge of our corner just stays nice and level with that finished binding that we have already stitched to the top and bottom edges. So make sure that that's nice and level, doesn't extend and it doesn't tuck in. You want it to be just right in line. All of those stacked together nicely, right in line. All right, so nice long thread tails. Pull those out, slide this underneath your foot, and then make sure to align so that way you get a nice 1/4 inch seam allowance. A few stitches on, a few stitches back. And doing that back stitching just really helps to keep it secure, and I am binding with isocord thread. It's pretty slippery, so having that little back stitch helps the thread not unravel off that edge. So I just have folded edge of the binding, where we have the backing fabric folded over. There's the edge of the quilt. This is our folded edge. And again, we're just simply stitching this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance to the back of the quilt. In a way, we're kind of treating this almost as if we're using binding, store-bought binding or binding that we've made by doing this line of stitching. But by doing this, we completely conceal that raw edge and any stitching that we've done along that edge, including our victory lap stitching. And I think that's really important because as I'm long arm quilting, I'm always stitching along the edges, and I couldn't get out of the habit of that and wanted a binding method that would completely conceal the edge, make that nice and pretty, and also be nice and secure. And I think that this really, I think it works. But I would love to know your favorite binding method in the comments below, whether you like to bind with binding pieces cut and pressed, if you like bias binding, prepackaged bias binding. I've done another video on that, if that's your preference, or you don't even have a preference yet, that you're just brand new to quilting and just trying everything out for the first time. So make sure to share your experience and what you like best in the comments below. I would love to hear that. So coming up here down on the bottom edge, you've got the folded edge of the backing binding. I'm making sure that's lined up perfectly with the already bound edge of the quilt. And I just stitch all the way down and make sure that it doesn't really squish outward. And then back stitch a few stitches and then stitch right off, leaving nice long thread tails. So here's the reason why we're keeping those nice long thread tails, and that is because we're going to do just a few stitches by hand with these thread tails, and it just helps to turn the corner of the binding. It just helps to kind of keep everything nice and straight, and it makes this edge, this corner, everything about it just really work out well. So you can see I'm flipping the binding over to the front. You can see how that looks perfectly encased. So I really think 2 inches for me is going to be about the perfect length. That's how wide I'm going to cut mine from now on, but understand you might want to go as wide as 2.5 inches if that works for you. So I am getting a little bit of this corner peeking out. So what I'm going to do is just grab my scissors and I'm just going to cut basically a little clean triangle. Just lop off the corner of the quilt, making sure not to cut my binding, and clean that up nicely. So now I can fold it back in place, making sure that everything's lined up nicely. And then now I'm going to basically just take a stitch into that corner, into that fold. And you can do as little stitching as you want, or you can do a lot of stitching. It's entirely up to you. And again, if you want a perfect finish for this and you don't want any of your stitches to show, then of course hand binding works well. So once I get that corner secured, so I pulled that in, now I'm going to take a stitch across into the opposite fold of that binding, and I'm basically just going to bounce back and forth across that corner, stitching into that folded edge. That's why we folded that corner over. Back and forth, probably 3 to 4 stitches will do it. You don't need a lot, but just having this extra thread tail really helps. You don't have to then go, thread another needle with more thread and have to bury the knot in the whole 9 yards. You've already got the threads right there, and you can just stitch back and forth, securing that edge, and that is our finished corner. Of course, we still need to stitch down this binding, but that is the finished look of the corner. You can see it's not a miter, but it still looks very, very nice. I'm very pleased with that. So once you get to that corner, you're going to tie a knot. You can also do a few back stitches, whatever works for you. I think I am going to do 1 back stitch, stitching back through one of the edges that I already stitched through, just to make sure it's nice and secure. Then I will tie an overhand knot and send that knot into the binding. I just run my needle down a little length and then tug on it. That knot tucks into the corner. We are ready to go. So I'm going to do that step, do that little bit of hand stitching on each of the corners, so that way they're nicely folded over, stitched in place, ready to go. And then all we have to do to finish is do that edge stitching right along the folded edge of the binding, securing it in place, and our binding is complete. Now, a few quick tips on this particular corner. I had that folded edge of the binding, extend a little bit beyond that edge, and you can see that did not have a very nice finish. So make sure that that folded edge is level, just perfectly level with the edge of the binding you previously done. You might also find, especially if you have a more inexpensive machine or a machine that just simply the foot height doesn't seem very variable, and the little Rebel is guilty of this, it does not handle super thick areas very well. And this area in the corner might be too thick and you might get bound up, especially as you're starting your seam. So I recommend actually starting the stitching right here on the inside edge of the quilt, leave nice long thread tails, and then just hand stitch that little section where the two pieces of binding overlap. I really think that's the best method. Let me show you what that looks like here. I'll get started stitching on this side, sliding this under, and I'm going to actually drop my needle down where the binding is actually hitting the quilt, not starting, way down here. I'm starting with it tucked nice in, and I'm going to drop my needle down, making sure that I can bring my thread tails up right there. So drop down, bring it up, tuck those thread tails underneath the foot, and then make sure that binding is nicely folded over and begin stitching. And you see, no issue, no binding up. The machine is just going to flow nicely through that, and then you can use those nice long thread tails to just hand stitch that little, it should be about a 1/4 inch long space, and secure that down as well. So here's what ended up being my least perfect corner, but I still consider that to be quite good. I really like this binding technique for speed and simplicity. I don't have to have any extra fabric, just enough fabric on the backing to pull it around to the front. And I think that this works out really well. It's very easy and fast. So come and check out the tools and supplies I used to make this video. You can check them out in the description below this video and at leahday.com. Until next time, let's go quilt. Bye-bye, see you later. Bye-bye, see you later.